You're watching the Eternal Tournament Series.
First week of the Eternal Tournament Series. I am Truedawn, and I am today joined by my wonderful co-host, LocoPojo.
Welcome, folks. It's good to be back.
And we were going to have a 6-round tournament today. We have 52 participants in our open. After those 6 rounds, we will be cutting to a single elimination top 8, and the winner will take home some cool prizes.
Should be pretty good time. Let's go ahead and talk about the matchups, shall we? Sorlix versus Tobboo. We're playing Feln Aggro versus TJP Midrange.
Yep, this is a deck that has risen to prominence pretty recently. I know Sir Rhino, I think, was one of the progenitors of the deck. Other people have iterated on it since. But the Feln Aggro deck, a new thing to the Eternal Tournament scene. It is a deck that is full of cheap threats as it gets in Eternal, as cheap answers as possible. It's trying to go underneath its opponents, trying to trade favorably on mana, and just tempo them out of the game, essentially.
Yeah, it's a very rapid, proactive deck. Definitely weighs on those Twilight Raptors, one of the really strong 1-drops if you can get the Seed of Cunnings out early. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting cards in here. Of course, you have the 3 Beast Colors Amulets, which make those Twilight Raptors all that much better. You have Midnight Gales, which are very strong legendary in this particular type of setup. And then, of course, you have Cabal Countess and all of the Stone Scar wonderfulness with Instigator and Countess and all the like.
Yeah, and there is an interesting addition that Sorlix has added here in Lethrai Falchion, something that is not traditionally played in this deck, as 4-drops are a little bit hard to swing given how low to the ground the deck is. But I think Lethrai Falchion, given Blood Beetle, Twilight Raptor, all these like small flyers that are just going to like get in, usually be uncontested, even if it gets one hit in, that life swing is going to be huge in a lot of matchups. So I do like seeing that addition of Lethrai Falchion. It's probably better than the other available 4-drops.
Yeah, in the meantime, we also have Tobboo on TJP Midrange. This is a really nice Combre plus Primal setup, very low to the ground, awakens students and temple scribes. We have 3 stand-togethers, which is a pretty sizable amount for a typical deck, but works very well if you're laying down as many 2-drops as you are with Tobboo.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about having a tournament format where you get to sideboard. You can choose to pre-board for certain matchups. You can afford to actually have cards that are bad in a certain matchup because you can side them out going to games 2 and 3. So Tobboo choosing to sideboard aggressively against decks that have Harsh Rule, Shimmer Pack, Crystallize, all that stuff. And then if he runs into other matchups, he can just side them out.
Yep, this matchup should be a little bit interesting because he does have, of course, the False Princes there, which is always nice until you run into a Shadow deck with enough Vara's favors. We'll see how well the answers match up, and I think that's going to be the determining factor as to whether or not the Feln Aggro deck can take it against the TJP.
Yeah, and Tobboo's draw is pretty well set up to combat what Sorlix is trying to do. He has most of his cheap cards. Everything in his hand costs 2 or 1. He's probably not going to get tempoed out, although he does need to eventually hit power because he only has 2 currently.
Yeah, Sorlix is left with a really interesting setup of power. He's probably going to distribute Primal and then Shadow so that he can get the double Shadow for Cabal Countess. This hand does prevent him from getting Midnight Gale on 3, but since he has both Argenport and Cabal Countess, I think he's probably in pretty good shape. Argenport's always just one of the strongest 2-drops you can play early on.
Yep. Midnight Gale, of course, being one of the cards that you can design given Eternal's rule set, where it has a higher influence cost than it does power cost, as double Shadow, double Primal. You actually need 4 influence, but it only costs 3 mana. So it makes it hard to cast in situations like this.
Tobboo opting for the Permafrost on the Argenport Instigator. Unfortunately, he does not draw his 3rd power, which he needs both to buff the Awakened students and start getting a little bit more tempo out in the terms of like Seraph and just generally like pushing a little bit more damage. So he's not the fast deck, but he's also currently at a slight advantage on board.
Yeah, it's the table's a little bit turned right now. Tobboo is ahead on board. He's trying to beat down with these Awakened students. If he hits a power, these Awakened students are a pretty big threat. They could attack into this Midnight Gale. And even if he doesn't draw power, which we see there he did not, he can use Desert Marshal to bring this Midnight Gale down to the ground or let it hit once, silence it later. He has a lot of options here.
Yeah, unfortunately, he still hasn't drawn his third power, and he needs, at the very least, time to play the Temple Scribes down and dig a little bit deeper. Right here, Midnight Gale is preventing him from doing anything crazy in terms of attacking. He'll have Desert Marshal to prevent the Midnight Gale from getting lifesteal, but as to how much tempo that's going to bring him, that's going to be a little bit difficult to
Yeah, there's a few ways he could go about this. He could let the Midnight Gale hit, silent instead of turn, let the Midnight Gale hit, not Desert Marshal at all. Desert Marshal, bring it to the ground, not block it. Desert Marshal, double block. There's a lot of ways he can go about this. He likes to just let it hit. There's a lot of things that were pretty reasonable there. It's because double blocking isn't great, letting it through isn't great. It's a bunch of choice between several suboptimal options.
Yep. Silencing Midnight Gale is always a little interesting because it not only gets rid of the infiltrate that gives it lifesteal, but it also just gets rid of lifesteal. So you have a lot of options as to how you want to deal with it. He chooses here to wait and see what Sorlix is going to play next before throwing the Desert Marshal, which is definitely a clever plan. From here, he really, however, does need to actually get a little bit more onto the board. And it looks like the Justice Sigil here is going to help.
And again, this is a spot where he has a lot of choices as to how he wants to progress this game. He can attack with both, as we see him doing here. He could have attacked with one, leaving the other back to Desert Marshal the 4/3 and block. Depends upon how aggressive he wants to be.
Yeah, it looks like we have a Seraph potentially, but opts to play the Desert Marshal instead. I'm not sure I agree with this line. I think the Seraph might have actually been the better play if you're going to play the Desert Marshal next turn. It depends on whether or not he wants to get down Sandstorm Titan on 4, which we know is a bad idea because of the Annihilate in Sorlix's hand.
I don't love the Desert Marshal when you're like leaving up Desert Marshal when you don't use it to silence and then double block, like you let it hit for 4. I think that's too much damage given how close this race is. So I don't hate leaving up Desert Marshal. I don't necessarily love the timing.
Yeah, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 damage on Tobboo's side. Sorlix is looking at 8 on clock, and Tobboo's down on health, so he is going to have to find some better answers than what he's currently got going on. If he uses the Amber Acolyte to search up some time, he can stall a little bit with Temple Scribes and get some of that health back, but leaving himself open to 2 attacking Midnight Gales does mean that just Rapid Shot is lethal, which has to be a scary situation.
Certainly, and it's worth noting that Argentport, while Permafrost is still in play, its ability is still relevant. If Tobboo was to double block, he would still take 2 damage from his creatures dying, so any chump blocks he can line up are a little less appealing given the Argentport triggers.
The nice thing about Amber Acolyte here is it does push his damage up to 8, which puts him on a 2-turn clock. And that actually does allow him to outrace Sorlix here as long as nothing crazy happens. He gets to either block or just ignore the 2 4/3s and then have 8 damage just sort of sitting tight and ready to go.
And we do see Tobboo trying to pump the brakes here, not throw attack down. Cabal Count just comes in end of turn. And now this is really close. That left-right Falchion, as we talked about in the pregame, that is poised to really swing this race if this Midnight Gale can stick, which Tobboo's going to try and do. And we do see he has Annihilate and backup to protect it.
Yeah, he's definitely trying to stick the Midnight Gale. He's also looking for a bad double block here. If Desert Marshal and Amber Acolyte block something, as opposed to both Desert Marshals, he can annihilate half of that and keep one of the Midnight Gales alive. But he might save the Annihilate for Sandstorm Titan, of course.
Yeah, I think that Sorlix is just, he wants to retain this Midnight Gale's flying as much as he can. So I think saving that Annihilate for Sandstorm Titan probably takes priority over flowing up a double block. I think you're kind of content for like this trade to happen. They still take 2 damage from the Argentport. You still have another 4/3. This seems fine to me. I think you save the Annihilate for something like Titan.
Yep. And the advantage here to this line of play is that there's only so many silences in Tobboo's deck. So if the silence doesn't come down on the Midnight Gale, that means that the Lethrai Falchion is pretty safe. And of course, like Cabal Countess being a 6/1 with quick draw is something that needs to be silenced as well. There's just a few too many targets for Tobboo to deal with, and he's already played 2 Desert Marshals. He's not likely to get a third.
Yeah, there's a point like when you're playing on the opposing side, you just kind of jam everything, hope they run out. They eventually will run out. And we do see here that Tobboo's out of silence effects. And this is the upside of the Feln aggro deck having all of their interaction be so cheap, because Sorlix gets to have a double spell turn here where you got to play Midnight Gale, leave up Annihilate, Backlash. Whereas Tobboo's like, he can play Temple Scribes, don't really affect the board, or he could have played only Titan. So this is where the tempo of how this deck is built is coming into play.
Yeah, there's two options for Tobboo here. One is the much safer option, which is to simply throw the permafrost. He could also temple scribe and try and dig for a power. I don't believe he's played his power for the turn, so doing it this way, of course, does guarantee that he hits his 5th power, but they're behind on board as a result, and he still has to just keep chump blocking this Cabal Countess.
Yeah, we'll likely just see the ult in the Cabal Countess and come in for 6, probably force a chump block. No other play is really appealing with these Annihilates and this Backlash. It is unfortunate you have to leave down Backlash, because it only leaves you with 1 mana left, but I do think that this is the play.
Yeah, it seems right. Once he actually gets 6th power, he can play down the Lithrai Falchion, or he can double Annihilate and just push in for 6 with the Backlash up. That Backlash does imply a pretty significant tempo gain, so there's a big problem here if he actually does get backlashed. It's just a little bit of extra damage that's probably going to count in terms of this.
Yeah, there's a lot of incremental damage in this deck. Argent triggers, Backlash, like little flyers chipping in. It all adds up over time. We will see the Annihilate come down in the Sandstorm Titan, clearing the way for this Cabal Countess. It'll be interesting to see whether they elect to Annihilate the Temple Scribe to come in for a full 6. The Annihilate does represent, like, 7 damage, pretty much. It's worth considering, but Sorlix deciding to hang back, being conservative, leaving up Backlash.
Yeah, these Annihilates are, of course, getting cross damage with Argenport Instigator. That card was never fully dealt with the Permafrost, so there's actually been quite a bit of extra damage dealt to Tobboo over the course of the game just by trading with units. Tobboo's only had small little creatures like Temple Scribe and Amber Acolyte and the Awakened Students, of course, and all of that has just stacked up against some fairly larger threats from Sorlix, meaning that he's just taking a little bit more damage than Sorlix is.
And this Surso's pretty big game. It makes the attacks for this Cabal Countess not good. Even if they equip the Lethrai Falchion, it at best trades with the opposing Surso, and actually... Yeah, I would trade with the Surso because it would still retain the quick draw if it only got blocked by Amber Acolyte. So Sorlix might see himself bereft of pressure if he makes this trade.
I suspect you want to make that trade anyways, however, unless you are going to let Surso attack in which case you're basically just banking on your opponent not to play a second Surso. Sorlix does have to do something with this Cabal Countess. Eventually, Tobboo will draw into Crystallize or some other card that can actually get rid of it, and at that point, he's just kind of dead in the water. These Lithrai Falchions do need to be used. If they're not pushed out, then it gets a little bit tricky for him. These cards just end up being dead in hand.
Yeah, and we do see Sorlix commit to the attack. They don't feel good doing this, but you do need to just try and push damage or like get this trade going, gain some life. The top deck war doesn't really favor you. Like your opponent's top decking like Sursos and Sandstorm Titans into your top decking 1 mana 2/2 flyers.
Yeah, he gains 5, his opponent loses 1, and that's closer to what he's looking for than you'd expect. Annihilate gets another point of damage, Backlash is another 2, so he just has to find 4 damage, and that may not actually be as difficult as it seems.
Yeah, any other creature is great. Twilight Raptor would be good for the Lethrai Falchion, although the clock is now on as this Seraph comes down, threatening to ultimate next turn. This is Titan. It'll be interesting to see whether or not you want to play Titan or ult Seraph. Titan is probably better than the average hit, and you're probably more concerned about presenting a better board than you are gaining card advantage. So it wouldn't be surprised to see the Sandstorm Titan played, but we do see the ultimate activated on Seraph, and it hits a Curio.
That's one of the best units that you can hit off of Seraph. It's dual colored. It has a tremendous amount of health. It has endurance, which means that it stabilizes the board in a really big way. And of course, it's just a big evasive flyer. So in situations where you're just completely out of cards, Curiox is definitely pretty tops. I can't think of that many cards that he could have hit that would be better. Like Ikaria is the only one I can think of. And yeah, unfortunately, that does seal it up for Sorlix.
Yeah, that was a pretty back and forth game. There was like a couple spots where I thought Tobboo was really favored, and then I thought Sorlix was really favored. Just a really interesting matchup, a lot of interaction. It's just the Feln deck coming up a little bit short. They really need to try and get underneath you, and once they fall behind, the deck really doesn't have tools to come back.
Yeah, those Lithrai Falchions can end up being just a weight around your neck if you don't have enough units to back them up with. And unfortunately, there was just too many answers from Sorlix. You had the Desert Marshals, you had just enough stuff that you didn't really need to be too worried about the equipment like Beast Caller's Amulet or Lithrai Falchion. Drawing 2 in particular was just very, very bad for Sorlix.
Yeah, and we will be moving to sideboard here. We will see how players elect to go about this. We can take a look at the sideboards. We'll start off with Sorlix's Felon Aggro deck. He has access to 3 Suffocate, 2 Backlash, 2 Plague, 3 Feeding Time, 2 Rain of Frogs, and 3 Steward of the Past.
Now we see 3 plagues coming out, which seems completely sensible. All 3 of the plagues are gone as well, or all 3 of the suffocates are gone as well, which is really interesting because that's a card that you generally use to get rid of Seraph, who tends to be pretty problematic for aggro decks. We see the Lothrai Falchions leaving, of course. That does seem like a pretty smart play with all of the Desert Marshals floating around. You definitely want to try and weigh on this deck a little bit more.
Yep. Sabotage certainly seems unblowing. Backlash also is limited utility. I'm not sure what the primary targets for it are. I guess Vanquish to protect your Midnight Gale. It's not irrelevant. I think we do see them shave on. Yeah. I think I don't want 4. 2 seems right.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of situations where Backlash is pretty good here. Of course, if you get the Vanquish, I don't think there's a harsh rule, but there's Stand Together, of course. And hitting Stand Together in particular is just a really big swing. Keep in mind that card does, of course, deal damage in addition to pressuring out spells. So I think it's actually not a bad choice here. And it's always nice to defend your units when you can.
Yeah, we'll be moving here into game 2. Seeing how things will play out. Tobboo is currently up a game against Sorlix. And Sorlix has a pretty good opening hand.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good hand if you're going first. If you're going second, Blood Beetles can be a little bit scary. And it looks like, yeah, this might end up being a little bit tricky for him. The Twilight Raptor is always a fun play if you can play it on 1. And here he gets to play 2 cards that can eventually be flyers. But there is no block from Tobboo. So, yeah, easy way to get some cheap flyers on the board and get started.
Yeah, this is a great start for Sorlix. Tobboo, unfortunately, having mana problems. He has a bunch of 2-drops in his hand, none of which he can cast. And that doesn't help. Yeah. So he will just pass the turn. And this is where the Felon deck is going to shine, where it gets to get ahead of its opponent and just bury them from that position.
Tobboo is left without a double time yet again, so he will be able to Amber Acolyte here and set up a second time for Temple Scribe or a green for whatever else he needs. I suspect that there are Lightning Storms coming in his sideboard, but I actually didn't get a look at it. A really impressive amount of damage very early on.
Although Tobboo's not dead, he has the 2 Desert Marshals, which essentially are removal spells for any of the 2/2 flyers, whichever one he chooses to kill. Then that just leaves 2 points of pressure on the board. He can just deal with that over time.
Yep, I mean, you always choose to hit the Blood Beetles and not the Twilight Raptor, just because the Blood Beetles can get bigger if they become resurrected. But I guess there isn't. It doesn't really matter here. I'm pretty sure there is no Dark Return in Sorlix's deck.
Yep, and this is a spot where Tobboo might be able to stabilize. The Twilight Raptor follow-up is pretty good. It still keeps 4 points of pressure in the air. And Tobboo's not under a huge clock, but he currently has no way to deal with what's going on above his head.
Yeah, the Temple Scribes will help if he can get that second time, of course. The green here does allow him to play Awakened Student, but it doesn't really seem particularly helpful. He's so far behind on health that playing more tempo on the board just doesn't really help him. He's mostly looking for a Lothrai Falchion equipped on one of these units so that he can vanquish it. That's how dire his situation is at the moment.
Yeah, Cumbry Healer is a pretty good draw. It's almost a time walk. It heals 3 when he's taking 4 a turn. I was just going to see Sorlix not play the Storm Dancer last turn. He's Perforos Seraph when the Seraph kind of doesn't matter right now. It can't block the flyers in the air. So I would have liked to see him add pressure. And again, we see him just playing passively behind this Backlash. And I think this is a little too conservative, considering that you're just trying to bury your opponent in this position.
I mean, the Backlash here is particularly good because you're looking at a Lightning Storm or some sort of harsh rule here, and if you actually do Backlash, that's just lethal, and it ends up that Tobboo doesn't in fact have the spell that he needs to get out from under this, but I think it's justifiable at least on that last turn.
It's interesting because players have deck lists. We know that Tobboo does not have harsh rule. He does not have Lightning Storm in the deck list, so I'm just not sure what Backlash is protecting against in that particular situation, but we will see the Flyers cross the finish line, tying things up at 1 game apiece, and we will be moving over to game 3 shortly.
All right. Yeah. Yeah, it looks like Tobboo's main answers to that kind of thing, like his main spell answers are Crystallize and Striking Snake, but didn't see either of those, and obviously was a little bit too far behind on power. So, yeah, we're looking at a really interesting game 3. This is the one for all the marbles.
Yeah, and this matchup looks really close. The Feln aggro deck is always like right on the razor's edge of getting across the finish line or just falling short. And Tobboo's actually had like pretty anemic draws. He stumbled both games and still been able to mount a reasonable defense. So that probably speaks volumes for how well his deck's situated in this matchup. But we'll see if he can actually have a reasonable draw, hit some power drops, and do some stuff this game.
Yeah, this should be pretty exciting. We're looking at Feln Banner or Diplomatic Seal first. Banner seems to make a lot of sense since you can still seal for the second blue. And Sorlix is pretty well set up here. He's got an easily available 2-drop followed by one of the most efficient 3-drops in the game, minus that influence cost. And manages to establish that Blood Beetle nice and early once again.
Yeah, unfortunately for Sorlix, there is going to be no 2-drop coming for Tobboo. Tobboo does have the option, however, to Permafrost one of these cards if he likes to do so. It doesn't seem particularly unreasonable, although Permafrost might want to be saved for the more potent threats like Argenport or possibly Midnight Gale, but he does have Vanquish to deal with the Midnight Gale. So maybe you just want to like stem some bleeding and play a Permafrost out this turn.
For being a more aggro-oriented deck, Tobboo's early draws have been pretty weak, which can actually help out in the late game because it gives you so many more late game threats if you have the 3-drops and the 4-drops that are more common to your deck. But I'm sure he would like an Awakened Student here or something to actually block that Blood Beetle.
Yeah, certainly. And again, we see nothing to deal with these flyers. He does have the Vanquish to deal with the Midnight Gale, and we will likely see that come down. But again, he's going to probably get chipped down for a lot of damage by these 2/2s.
Vanquish plus Permafrost is quite a bit of chip delayed, but it still leaves him with a 2/2 on the board, which means he's still taking damage. He could try to develop his own board a little bit with things like Combre Healer. I feel like the extra damage he's taking from Midnight Gale makes that option a little bit less justifiable, even if it is more efficient.
It's also worth getting your spells, like casting removal when your opponent's tapped out to play around Backlash. So when you have the opportunity to use removal when they're tapped out, it's probably worth doing so.
Yep, if you can just blank those, can be very helpful here. We see Knight Chancellor Seraph coming down. That's a decent blocker against the Argenport Instigator. Fortunately, Tobboo is still very resilient to Annihilate, so there's not a lot that Sorlix is going to be able to do on that front.
Yeah, Annihilate's a bit of an awkward card in this particular matchup. You do need it because you do need, like, Sandstorm Titan is very, very challenging for Sorlix to beat if you can't remove it. So you need Annihilate for that. But most of the other creatures in Tobboo's deck aren't legal targets.
Yeah, we have Combre Healer here as a potential blocker and Temple Scribe. Combre Healer to make after Temple Scribe just to see if you want to sort of order your Combre Healer a little differently and make a 1/4 Temple Scribe.
Yep. It's whenever you have to draw cards, you want to do that first. The thing you draw may change what your play is.
Yep. But
it looks like
going for the standard Combre Healer. Yeah.
Yep. And we'll see the flyers come in, deal 4. Cerso is going to come down, and it's going to be hard to race back. Tobboo needs to deal with these flyers. The Cerso is like a big clock, but it's not big enough. He's too far behind at this point.
Yeah. Snake or a Crystallize, and unfortunately there is a Backlash in Sorlix's hand, so Xenon Obelisk will help him with pushing. In fact, it'll help him quite a bit. He can leave a blocker up if he wants to and then swing for a full 10, or he can just attack for 7.
I think he has to leave the Combre Healer back if the Argenport attack is too good, because you'd have to jump out with the Temple Scribe that puts him down to 8, then the flyers are 2-turn clock instead of a 3-turn clock.
Yep. The set up pretty well here. The next Primal Sigil does put him at 8, which is really nice. Unfortunately, Permafrost is definitely a clear answer to Seraph here. I'm not sure why to play the Primal Sigil apart from the seat. I guess to bluff that you have another spell. And from there, wants to keep pushing.
Yeah, does this attack put him
that attack
on board?
is game. He can get annihilated on the Temple Scribe, and then he'll be
Without the Annihilate, though, right? Just alphas and like 4 comes through in the air, one of the Argenport's trades. So, I mean, he was dead regardless, but that will be the conclusion of this game in the favor of Sorlix.
Yeah. And looked like it went very well for him.
Yeah, it's certainly cool to see the Felon aggro deck having success. And it's a relatively new deck, hasn't been around for a while, and it's really a testament to the depth and complexity of the Eternal format, the first format they've had, that people are still finding new stuff, considering how long it's been out. Still being able to iterate on new decks and find even completely new archetypes.
There's a lot of really fun archetypes out of there. Felon aggro has always been one of my favorites. I think I used to play a lot of it back in closed. It was pretty cute, but it never really saw a lot of tournament play, so it's nice to see a competitive version of it.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of decks in Eternal that are like borderline, and I think could be tournament contenders if people skilled enough put the time in to cultivate the archetype. But a lot of people just say like, "Oh, this archetype's like bad. It's not big combat. It's not Scone Scar. I'm not even going to try and iterate on it." And then the people who do get really heavily paid off by finding these new angles in the format.
Yep, it's the standard self-fulfilling prophecy type thing, where if you are particularly fond of an archetype, or if you think that archetype is overpowered, you will see a lot more of the decks of that type. But I think there is a sizable amount of excellent balance to Eternal, and we do see a lot of archetypes as a result. So it's a really cool format and a really cool game, and always glad to be casting it.
Yeah, certainly. We're seeing if we can get a backup match for you guys. We're hammering that out right now. But till then, I think it's really awesome that this Felon aggro deck is able to carve out a spot because of there was kind of a lack of good aggro decks outside of Stone Scar. It's like they kind of have a monopoly on that, and it's interesting to see new ways for people to attack that with different types of interaction, like having backlash and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you always have a Ricano, and then the Combre archetype tends to be a little bit more oriented towards tempo, or at least it feels a little slower, although it can sometimes be pretty overwhelming. But pretty much most of the color pairings have a solid aggro archetype. Trying to think, there isn't really a very strong Elysian one at the moment, but Stormlink's Ambush can be pretty reasonable with Xenon Obelisk, and that tends to usually just mutate into a more token-oriented strategy if you're going to be doing like Shimmer Pack or something like that.
Yeah, that's one of the problems I found with Elysian is I would like to build like more aggressively slanted mid-range decks involving like Cerso and False Prince, but it doesn't really have 1 or 2 drops. And we actually have found a backup match for you guys. We have Toth between EleshNorn, Toth on his famed Akari Gold deck, and he appears to be playing against a very interesting Xenon deck that currently has a Whispers of the Void going.
Oh yeah, Whispers of the Void is always fun in Xenon. If you get the Xenon Obelisk down with it, that's a really significant value engine that can be very difficult to deal with. I'm not sure. We'll see the deck lists in.
Yeah, we can get you that because this is currently
Praxis version.
This is game 2. Toth is up 1-0. If we go to game 3, we'll get sideboards. But yeah, this is certainly an interesting deck. Xenon is one of the other color combinations that's seen a lot of iteration in a lot of different directions, be it control, potential ramp decks with Zendel, the Wayfinder, a lot of stuff going on in this color combination.
Yeah, Toth is in a pretty sticky situation. With Whispers already down, that means that EleshNorn's board is always going to be building. He does have the Mystic Ascendant. The Mystic Ascendant appears to be just sort of okay for what it's doing, but he's going to have to find some better ways to push across. And I'm not sure that Silencing the Sandstorm Titan is necessarily going to do it. From here, he's got enough blockers for quite a while. These 1/1s, of course, always represent damage, even if they don't represent like a significant board presence, because there's 2 Whispers in the Voids a-ticking. So yeah, that's a lot of extra damage that Toth is going to have to deal with.
Toth total is not particularly high. It's at 11. For those who don't know, the 1/1s that are created by the Whispers of the Void have an Entomb trigger that deals 1 damage to the opposing player. So EleshNorn can just keep attacking with the 1/1s, and they're going to deal 1 damage whether they're blocked or not. So Toth is like probably has like 3-4 turns.
I'd say he has 2. It's possible that he can live for another one, but got 3 damage here. We've got.
Well, that makes the attacks a lot better.
Yeah, the Sandstorm Titan, of course, is going to have to probably get chump blocked. In a grand situation as far as the rest of that goes, we have 4 damage here, plus 5 in the actual tokens. I think that the next push is probably going to kill Toth.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what he can draw to at this point. Even like Harsh Roll domes him for 5, and then 2 more spawn anyway. His opponent's at 23, so he can't really hope to race back. I'm really struggling to see a way for Toth to wiggle his way out of this situation.
Yeah, iReNGee on Ascendant would definitely have been his saving grace, but he didn't draw the power that he needed that turn. So we are going to see a concession, and we're going to move into game 3. Is that correct?
Yes, we're going to game 3. We can actually look at deck lists. EleshNorn is playing a Zenith Whispers deck, as you saw there. There is 3 copies of Whispers of the Void, 2 Vara, Fate Touched. So it is, essentially a Xenon mid-range deck, more slanted to control, trying to get to the end game with these Whispers and these Varas. And you're going to get the Tormentor, Mystic Ascendant. A lot of end game.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun way to sort of secure the late game. Vara the Fate Touched and Whispers in the Void are both really solid ways to make sure that you just never, ever, ever have to worry about bad top decks. You just there's so much value that you're getting as a result. And with the Umbran Reapers here pushing across a little bit of health gain, along with the Lumen Defenders, there's a lot of ways to sort of recover if the Xenon deck gets too far behind in the early game. So you have to kill the deck quickly, or you might not be able to kill the deck at all.
Yeah, I think Toth is definitely the beat down this deck. You do see in the sideboard he has access to things like Ikaria, Jack. Reality Warden probably comes in here. It doesn't... I don't think it stops the 1/1s from coming to play. I know that there was like a bug with the 1/1s that they like spawn in the graveyard and then go into play. Don't know if that affects Reality Warden. I don't think that's supposed to work that way.
It should stop the 1/1s from going into play. I think that's even intended effect. Like they are created in the void and then they come back because they're created by the Tormentor. But I could be wrong about that. It's possible that there's that might be something where you'd have to look at the wording and you'd have to look at like how the actual code works.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the interaction on that. But either way, Reality Warden stops Vara, so it's probably coming in. Deep Forge Plate is another thing that will help Toth like give the beatdown. So I really think Toth needs to get the game over with before EleshNorn's more powerful endgame with Vara, Mystic Ascendant, all that stuff takes over.
Mystic Ascendant, Ikaria the Liberator, and iReNGee at the top. Great Parliament is a really strong card here for Toth. Basically anything that gives him a lot of flyers is really helpful. And I think that Healer's Cloak will probably come in handy because having a little bit of extra health against the Xenon Whispers deck can really help you out in the late game. Just being a little bit higher on life total means that you can withstand those Whispers tokens for a lot longer.
Yeah, definitely. You do want a non-zero amount of life gain. I can see that. We do see Toth with as fast a draw as his deck could probably generate with Seraph and Amber Acolytes. He's really going to need to get to some of his high power haymakers quickly.
I was expecting